Hi, I'm Teresa from Phoenix Gate Crafts, and today I wanted to talk about if you're new to knitting or crochet, the order in which you can do some projects so that you can maximize learning some skills and what skills you need to know in a general order. So before I begin, I really want to put a caveat out there that I'm giving you this order because it's a very useful order. That does not mean that this is the order in which you need to do stuff. These are recommendations based on skill advancement, but I'm being a bit of a hypocrite because I didn't do it this way, either for knitting or for crochet. And I'm going to go through one and then the other. And I think I'm going to do it in my own personal chronological order because why not? Sometimes I think crocheters should go first. So anyway, for each one, I'm going to tell you the order in which I learned it, and then I'm going to tell you my recommendations so that maybe you won't find the pitfalls that I've found. All right, so here we go. So the way that I learned to crochet was actually from the mom of a dancer who was in the class before my dance class. She came in waiting for her daughter to finish her class and was crocheting, and I watched her do it, thought, oh, that's pretty cool. I wonder what she's doing. I've never seen anything like that. And she told me it was crochet. She let me do a couple of stitches, and that weekend I wound up going to Joann Fabrics, getting a random ball of yarn and a random crochet hook, and just kind of brought them the next time. She taught me how to chain and how to start, and I learned double crochet. Later, I wound up purchasing a how-to crochet book that I had a lot of trouble understanding, and I learned the half double crochet, and I think I figured out single crochet. And I know I kind of invented a couple of stitches, which I now know are extended single crochets. And I kind of did one that was a sort of extended double crochet. It was kind of weird. And I'm pretty sure I just invented a stitch that now I realize probably doesn't work so well. And that's what I did for years and years and years. Single stitch blankets, single stitch scarves, that primarily either had half double crochets or double crochets. Until I found Jada in Stitches. I will link her channel down below, and I did her chevron zigzag blanket pattern so I could make a little blanket for myself and a little blanket for my husband for Christmas in 2017. And then I just picked up from there. I just started watching YouTube videos, and I had my yarn and my hook, and I learned about hooks. I learned about different types of yarn, and I was just mass watching YouTube videos, which I assume is what you're doing because you stumbled on this video. That's a good way to learn, is just, watching a video and being like, yeah, I can do that, and then giving it a try and figuring yourself out. I did that for a couple of months, and then in March 2018, I found the Moogly Cow. So Tamara Kelly owns the Moogly blog at mooglyblog.com. I'll link it down below. And every year she does a crochet along where every 2 weeks on Thursday, a 12-inch by 12-inch granny square pattern is released. A whole bunch of different designers are collaborating every single year, and the blankets are very there's 24 squares in a blanket, and each square is unique. There's texture, there's color. They can be fairly complicated. Some are simpler than others, and some are very complex. The 2018 one that I did, in the first few months, I learned the popcorn stitch, I learned the crocodile stitch, I learned bobbles. I learned front post double crochets. It's basically a very good skill study that really forces you to learn stitches quickly. And then by that summer, I did the Study in Texture Afghan by Yarn Inspirations, which is, well, the Crochet Crowd. Then in 2018, in the summer, I did the Crochet Crowd Study in Texture Afghan, which again had a whole bunch of different stitch patterns. By those two projects, I learned pretty much every stitch. I had gotten really good at reading patterns, and I was pretty much off to the races and ready to start learning how to knit. So if you're not feeling brave enough to just jump into complex patterns, I don't blame you. It is not an ideal way to learn unless you are very brave or very unafraid of messing up. But there's a much easier way to do it. So I would start by doing washcloths. I would get a size 4 worsted weight yarn in acrylic. So pretty much any Red Heart Super Saver or Caron 1 pound. Get a color you like, but get a cheap yarn so you don't mind if you get super frustrated and it doesn't work out, you don't mind just cutting and chucking. Also, I recommend getting either a 5.5 or a 6.0 millimeter crochet hook. It's a little bit bigger so that way you can have a little bit more control while you're learning. It might be worthwhile to get a set of crochet hooks so that way you can kind of fiddle around with different sizes while you're learning and just kind of get a feel for what size hook you like and what size hooks, that way you have hooks you need for any patterns that you find on YouTube or on Ravelry. So first thing you need to learn how to do is chain. Then you need to learn, in no particular order, single crochet, double crochet, and half double crochet. Then I would learn V-stitch, and I would learn how to make a granny square. And I would make a washcloth or a dishcloth in each one of these. Washcloth is probably better because you really want cotton yarn for a dishcloth. It's a little bit more sturdy. So a washcloth just being, about this big, you can chain about 20 to 30 stitches, and it's enough to practice each one of these patterns. The granny square starts in the center, and the Jada in Stitches granny square tutorial, she has several washcloth tutorials that I highly recommend. There's basically going to be a huge list of patterns and YouTube videos in the description box for everything that I'm mentioning from here on out. So I recommend really working on those. I recommend doing washcloths because they're small, but it's enough to get familiar with a stitch and comfortable with it, especially the ones that have to work back and forth. Once you've done a granny square, at that point, you're kind of off to the races because you can do a bunch of different things. At this point, I would recommend going and trying out the Moogly Cal or following some of the cals from the Crochet Crowd. Marley Bird also has some pretty interesting beginner YouTube tutorials, particularly regarding planned color pooling. That could be interesting. But also realize that every single stitch is based off of chains, single crochets, and double crochets. So once you know those 3 stitches, you can figure out all the others because they're just variations of that. So I think at that point you're actually in pretty okay shape. Oh, I would also learn how to do a flower. So a flower applique. I will have a really good tutorial, as well as a few other applique tutorials because they teach about general shaping. Once you've got these stitches, you might want to try something a little bit bigger. So maybe a scarf. This is a good time to try a hat that's crocheted in the round. You might also want to try making some tote bags or a cup cozy and a soap saver scrubby bag. These are all pretty good different tutorials on different formations. Jada and Stitch's big beautiful basket is excellent for basket construction. And anyway, once you have all of these, I recommend doing the moogly. That's when you do the moogly. Now let's talk about knitting. For knitting, again, get a ball of Caron 1 pound or Red Heart Super Saver in a color of your choice. Make sure whatever you get is cheap so you don't mind cutting and chucking if you don't like what you're doing, so you don't feel too bad about having to undo. Also get either a basic set of needles. Now, needles are a little bit tricky because there are so many different options. And your first set's gonna kind of suck because you're not necessarily knowing what kind you want to get. I do recommend starting with either straight needles or fixed circulars and just getting a couple sizes, maybe 5, 5.5, or 6 millimeter to go with your ball of yarn. So you'll want to learn how to cast on, do knit stitch, because when you do knit stitch across and then turn and knit stitch the other way and then turn and knit stitch and turn and knit stitch, that's called garter stitch. And you can do garter in knit stitch and you can do garter in purl stitch. So when you start knitting, you need to first learn how to cast on. I recommend the cable cast on or the long tail cast on to start. Then you need to learn how to knit, and then you need to learn how to bind off. Then you need to learn how to purl. So knitting every single row or purling every single row creates a stitch pattern called garter stitch. So you've got knit garter and purl garter. Though usually when somebody refers to garter stitch, they're just talking about the knit garter stitch. But you'll want to make a little washcloth that is just knit garter stitch, and you'll want to make a separate one that is just purl garter stitch, because knit and purl are the entire basis of knitting. Everything else is a variation on knit and purl. So you have to have both of those feeling comfortable and done correctly. Then you can do one that is in stockinette stitch, which is one row of knit stitches and one row of purl stitches. It will curl in on itself. Don't worry about it. It's just getting used to recognizing what this stitch looks like. Then you'll probably want to do a 1x1 ribbing or a 2x2 ribbing. So a 1x1 ribbing is one knit stitch, one purl stitch, one knit stitch, one purl stitch, all the way across. Cast on an even number for this. Or 2x2 ribbing is knit 2, purl 2. Knit 2 stitches, purl 2 stitches. This one you'll want to cast on a multiple of 4. Then you'll want to make a hat, because when you make a hat, you're learning how to knit in the round. You're also learning decrease stitches. So you'll learn how to do knit 2 together and an SSK, which is slip, slip, knit. So those are two very handy skills. Then I would recommend making a triangle shawl, because you're learning the garter tab cast on, and then you're going to learn increases. So the increases you'll want to learn are make one right, make one left, and yarn over. You can make 2 different shawls using these. So usually you make one right and make one left because they lean opposite directions. and then you'll use yarn overs. Sometimes you'll use a lace pattern that is a yarn over knit two together, because when you yarn over you're making a stitch, and when you knit two together you're reducing by a stitch, so that way you're actually keeping the stitch number even. Anyway, once you've done all of these, you'll be ready to make socks. You'll have all the skills except for two things. Slip stitches and Kitchener stitch are the two things you'll have to learn to make socks if you're making them cuff down. If you're making socks toe up, you'll need to learn the Turkish cast on or Judy's Magic cast on. At that point, you might want to experiment with some different cast on techniques and some different bind off techniques. But I'll leave that to you to decide which ones you want to do. I really highly recommend Marley Bird's My First Knit Blink series. She's got my first knit shawl, my first knit socks. She's actually got two series on socks. One is cuff down and one is toe up. She's also got my first knit sweater and my first knit vest. So that's actually a very good series to go through in order, and I'll have it in the description box. Also, pretty much anything you want to learn in terms of any unique skill, I highly recommend Marley Bird, Very Pink Knits, and Roxanne Richardson. So something I noticed, a lot of people highly recommend Very Pink Knits, but I found when I was learning that she made more sense to me once I kind of had an idea of what I was doing. When I was a raw beginner, she wasn't that good for me. Roxanne Richardson was a little bit better. But Marley Bird, hands down, for raw beginners, very beginning. So for very beginners, I highly recommend Marley Bird. Then once you're a little bit more familiar with knitting, going to Roxanne Richardson. And then once you're quite familiar, going to Very Pink Knits. But again, that's my personal preference. So the way I learned how to knit, I first taught myself the knit stitch and the cast on and the bind off. And I did the knit garter. Then I did a purl garter. And then I BS'd my way through a hat pattern. I do not recommend doing that. And then I made socks. And then I made my first shawl. And I noticed with knitting, I prefer simpler patterns. At this point, I can read patterns. I can do charts. I can do anything I want. I can do cabling. These are more complex skills. But I still like stockinette is one of my favorite things because I really like the repetitive nature of that. Anyway, once you're able to do socks, I highly recommend giving some basic color work a try. I would recommend Tin Can Knits pattern, the Mountain Mist sweater. So you'll learn how to do a sweater and you'll learn how to do very simple color work. And then I recommend learning how to do cables and other stitch patterns, in which case I recommend doing the Kelborn Knits Year of Hats. Again, all these links are going to be in the description box. And anyway, once you're able to do these skills, it really is just a matter of going on Ravelry.com or YouTube and finding things that you're interested in making. And just remember, whatever you do, this is my recommendation. You don't have to do it this way. You can do whatever you want in whatever order you want. And ultimately, if you have a little trouble with a stitch pattern, maybe take a break, try something a little easier, and just work your way up to it. You'll be able to do anything you set your mind to, and sometimes it's just a matter of watching a YouTube video on a particular stitch you're not understanding, or giving yourself a little bit more time to develop as a knitter. But I'm not going to tell you not to try anything, because you know what? If you don't try it, you won't potentially succeed at it. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. Good luck in your endeavors and happy crafting. Bye.